Okay, welcome everyone. This is a webinar on ICCAs in international policy. My name is Holly Jonas. I'm the International Policy Coordinator for the ICCA Consortium, and we're going to be speaking today about how ICCAs are recognized in international policy and law. So first, a very quick refresher on ICCAs. ICCA is an abbreviation for territories and areas conserved by Indigenous peoples and local communities. They're the jewels, the hearts, and the seeds of biocultural diversity around the world. They're extremely diverse. They're found in all the world regions. They span all types of ecosystems and really incredibly diverse. And there are three main characteristics, despite this diversity, that we can talk about when talking about ICCAs. So the first is that there's a very strong bond between the community and their territory. And it's a self-identified community and the self-identified territory as well. This could be in the terrestrial space or the marine space, or a combination of both. The community is able to take and enforce decisions and rules on their territory. This is the second main characteristic of ICCAs. So they have a particular governance capacity within their community. And these contribute to maintaining the territory in so-called good condition for nature and for the community. So this is regardless of the intention of those rules and those decisions, it does contribute in some way to conservation, to nature, and to community well-being. So in some cases, the motivation for an ICCA might be for spiritual or cultural purposes, but it does in fact contribute to conservation. So the ICCA Consortium's mission as an organization is to promote the appropriate recognition of and support to communities, to ICCAs at local, national, and international levels. So appropriate legal recognition of ICCAs is a crucial part of achieving this mission. And this webinar provides a brief overview of how ICCAs are currently recognized in international law. It does not go into any detail about legal recognition at the national or subnational level. That will be the topic of hopefully another webinar. So how do we understand the law? Before we get into specific details of ICCAs in international law, we first want to step back and look at how we understand the law and the bigger picture at that level. So we'd like to raise three key points about the law. The first is that we can look at the law as an ecosystem in and of itself. So just like an ecosystem, which has many different species that interact with each other, the mother is multi-layered, it's complex, it has lots of different laws occupying different niches that interact with each other as well. So if you can imagine a sort of a three-dimensional map of an ICCA that might have rivers, it might have agricultural areas, it might have sacred sites and so on. Each part of that ICCA will have at least one law that aims to so-called regulate human activity. So this you could consider as a sort of horizontal layer in that 3D map of the ICCA. And because local and state laws are not the only ones that affect an ICCA, we also think about regional and international laws. So we can almost picture a vertical layer of laws on that map of the ICCA, as well as the horizontal layer across the landscape. And we should also remember the legal system is very dynamic. Actually, it's not static. Laws and institutions do change, and therefore when we think about our advocacy and engagement efforts, they can be changed with the right pressures and the right motivations. The second point that we should consider about the law is that it actually fragments connected systems. So as we discussed in the last slide, there are many different laws imposed on different parts of an ICCA. And each of those laws focuses on a specific component in isolation of all the others. So for example, forestry laws are seen as totally separate from water resources laws, totally separate from wildlife laws, totally separate from biodiversity laws even. So this obviously seems absurd because these systems are interlinked in reality, but that's how the state laws work, or don't work in some cases. So in addition, each law is implemented by a separate institution, and these institutions generally work in silos. So we have kind of layers of fragmentation and isolation. These laws and institutions effectively fragment ICCAs into sort of different components when they would otherwise be very interconnected in reality. And so in this regard, the law can be seen as conflicting in many ways with community worldviews. So for most Indigenous people's worldviews, everything is interconnected. So interconnected not just physically, but also culturally and spiritually. So this is just one example of how laws created by state governments do conflict with Indigenous and community worldviews and customary law. These state-created laws often prioritize the rights of individuals, and it sets the foundation for profit-driven market economy, which also kind of sets the stage for broader conflict with ICCAs. So now we'll have a short video clip on Indigenous law.
I think the best way to think about Indigenous law is that they are collaborative reasoned processes that Indigenous peoples, our societies, managed ourselves through time. We were able to have intellectual resources through our stories. We were able to draw from those to solve problems, solve conflicts, and deal with all of the messiness which is created when human beings live together.
Law is what grounds us to the earth and those relationships we have with our territories, with the animals, with the plants.
Indigenous peoples were the first law keepers and law givers in this land. In Anishinaabe, which is the Indigenous language that I can speak from the Great Lakes area, we organize life in accordance with principles of Minnow B'Madazuin, which means to try to live well in the world.
For me, the large context that I like to think about for law is the set of stories that help us regulate ourselves and our relations with others.
In its best form, the way to think about law that's helpful is that it enables human dignity and agency and provides ways for people to challenge internal oppressions, internal power dynamics.
So after looking at the bigger picture of how we understand the law, we can now turn to how ICCAs are recognized in international law. So we have 2 points. First, we're going to look at where ICCAs are explicitly recognized for their many contributions to nature and biodiversity conservation. And the first one of these two is within IUCN. So this is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And this is a member-based union. It's one of the largest and oldest conservation organizations in the world. And it meets approximately every 10 years for a World Parks Congress and approximately every 4 years for a World Conservation Congress, where they adopt resolutions and recommendations and sometimes action plans. So at the 2003 World Parks Congress in Durban in South Africa, this was the first time that ICCAs, then called CCAs or Community Conserved Areas, this is the first time that they were recognized in international policy. So it was quite a big moment for the ICCA movement. And in Durban as well, the broader set of resolutions, recommendations, action plans that were adopted were called by some as this new protected areas paradigm. It really brought in a focus on governance diversity. It also referred to respect for human rights as an advance for conservation rather than as something that would hinder conservation. So there was a lot of focus on governance, participation, equity, and rights at that World Parks Congress. And since then, at every World Conservation Congress since 2004, as well as the subsequent World Parks Congress in 2014, ICCAs have been recognized explicitly in the decisions of IUCN, so those recommendations and resolutions. The second main area of international law now is within the UN Convention on Biodiversity. So this is an international environmental treaty with 196 state parties. So these are governments that have agreed to be legally bound by the terms of the convention. So very, very shortly after the World Parks Congress in 2003 first recognized ICCAs, the 2004 Conference of the Parties of the CBD, which is the body that takes decisions, in 2004, the CBD parties first recognized ICCAs in that forum. So that was the first time in international law itself that ICCAs were recognized. And since then, in every Conference of the Parties, which is every 2 years since 2004, there have been decisions by the CBD on diverse topics across the convention on issues such as not just protected areas, but also traditional knowledge, customary sustainable use, on climate change, on agriculture, on sustainable development, and more topics. So really across the convention, ICCAs are recognized in lots of different types of COP decisions. So this means they're not just within the protected area framework, they're really seen and recognized by parties to the convention as contributing to virtually the whole convention across all of these different topic areas. In terms of upcoming opportunities within the CBD process, the national reports, so each party, each country that is a party to the convention has to submit a national report by the end of this year, 2018, on the activities that they're doing to implement the convention and to meet the 2020 strategic plan and Aichi targets. So often these reports have not included very much information about Indigenous peoples and local communities, about the contributions of communities to conservation. So this is a really big gap, but also a big opportunity for communities and supporting organizations to pitch into those national reports and to really help communicate to governments and to the rest of the world everything that's happening in their countries around ICCAs and other activities of Indigenous peoples and local communities more broadly. The second key opportunity that's coming up in the next 2-year cycle of the CBD is the preparation of this post-2020 biodiversity framework. So this is going to follow from the current strategic plan, which is from 2011 to 2020. And the expectation is that perhaps the next strategic plan, or whatever it will be called, might align the timeline with the Sustainable Development Goals. So there are a lot of conversations starting to happen about what this next biodiversity framework should include, how it should be developed, a lot of proposals, of course, around broader participation and inclusion of Indigenous peoples and local communities, of women, of youth, and other typically underrepresented groups. So that's definitely an opportunity within countries, but also at the international level, to try to influence the CBD process. So, along with growing recognition of ICCAs in international conservation policy, so in IUCN, as well as international biodiversity law in the CBD, there's also now growing recognition of the links between human rights and environment. So in the words of Professor John Knox, who is the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, we are well on our way to the 6th global extinction of species in the history of the planet. And states are still failing to halt the main drivers of biodiversity loss, including habitat destruction, poaching, and climate change. What is less well understood is that the loss of biodiversity undermines the enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, including rights to life, rights to health, food, and water. So while the loss of biodiversity affects everyone, the worst off are those who depend most closely on nature for their material and cultural life. He continues by saying, biological diversity and human rights are interlinked and interdependent. The two must go hand in hand. Protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and others directly dependent on that law, it is often the best way of protecting biodiversity. So he really is supporting and further progressing a lot of narratives that the ICCA Consortium has also been talking about for many years, and also a lot of scientific discourse coming out about the links between secure tenure and rights of communities and Indigenous peoples with the contributions to conservation and nature protection. And he's particularly making that crucial link between those things and fundamental human rights. This is not just an issue of conserving things, but also a matter of really clear human rights links. So this brings us now to ICCAs in the international human rights system. And ICCAs are explicitly recognized in reports of 2 UN Special Rapporteurs. So the first one is John Knox. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment. And he issued a 2017 report on human rights and biodiversity that really underscores the linkages between them. So in 2 of his recommendations, he recognizes ICCs explicitly, stating that states should support Indigenous peoples and local communities' efforts to protect biodiversity, including through ICCAs. He also recommended that businesses should respect human rights in their biodiversity-related actions, including by not seeking or exploiting concessions in protected areas or ICCAs. 2 major recommendations, one to states, one to businesses, both of which recognize ICCAs explicitly. And building on his work, this report, amongst many other reports and mapping exercises, the UN Environment Programme has just launched the Environmental Rights Initiative in March 2018, which includes a policy on environmental defenders, both of which provide opportunities for collaboration around ICCAs.
I've learned over the years that I'm not alone. Thousands of people from around the world risk their lives protecting their way of life. Their rights over food, water, clean air, and land, they stand up for their basic human rights. We risk our lives for it. When Honduran environmental activist and indigenous leader Berta Cáceres was killed, the world seemed to finally take notice. But this isn't just about indigenous communities, the poor, the marginalized. This is about everyone, because environmental rights are enshrined in over 100 constitutions. Even with so many people recognizing their rights, often people are unable to assert them when business or government are not held accountable for environmental violations. But more and more people are using the law to challenge those who violate environmental rights. From the United States of America, where 21 youth are suing the government for failing to protect them from impacts of climate change, and China, where a new environmental law has enabled groups to file a successful lawsuit against a mining company for polluting a major city, to India, where the Supreme Court sided with the Dongria Kondh tribe in a 12-year battle against mining bauxite on their land by giving the community control over the project. But they and we can't do it alone. There's strength and courage in numbers. So find out what's going on in your community or online. Get involved and participate in environmental decision making. Empower yourself, empower those around you. And if all that fails, you must know how to access legal support and assistance. Be part of advancing environmental rights and access to justice in your community. Taking care of our planet in a way that respects the human right to life and to a clean and safe environment is the only way we can ever hope to see a healthy and productive home for current and future generations. This initiative will bring environmental protection nearer to the people by helping them to better understand their rights and how to defend them, and by working with governments and business to implement environmental rights obligations. UN Environment is calling on you to protect, promote, and respect your planet by knowing your environmental rights, by reporting violations of environmental rights to local authorities, and by denouncing violations of those rights. Protect, promote, and respect the right to a clean and healthy planet.
So the second special rapporteur who has referred to ICCAs in the reports is Victoria Corpus from the Philippines. And she's the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And she did a report in 2016 on the impacts of conservation measures on Indigenous peoples' rights. And just to flag that she is specifically focusing on Indigenous peoples, not including local communities, because her mandate is restricted to the rights of Indigenous peoples. So within her reports, that's the scope limitation as well. So her 2016 report critiques the displacement of Indigenous peoples in the name of conservation, which has happened for many years and is still continuing to happen to this day, unfortunately. She also critiques the failure to recognize the complexity of ecological and social relationships of many Indigenous peoples with their ecosystems, as well as their right to own and manage and control their territories, lands, and resources. So she refers to growing evidence that territories of Indigenous peoples that have land rights have been significantly better conserved than adjacent lands. So again, kind of reiterating, or actually predating John Knox's report, bringing up similar issues around links between secure land tenure for Indigenous peoples and the conservation outcomes. She also referred to growing evidence about many of the world's better conserved forests and savannas and waters are found within Indigenous peoples' territories. So her report calls on IUCN for its limited progress towards recognizing ICCAs. So even after having adopted many resolutions and recommendations that do refer to ICCAs, IUCN is lagging behind still quite a lot in terms of actual recognition on the ground of ICCAs. She also recommends that conservation organizations support Indigenous peoples to develop and sustain their own conservation initiatives and traditional conservation measures. Finally, she recommends that donors provide direct funding for Indigenous peoples' own conservation initiatives as well. And she is currently working on a report this year on criminalization of Indigenous peoples, which unfortunately is now very close to home for her, as she has been targeted amongst many others in the Philippines by the national government, labeled as a terrorist, very unfairly so, unjustly so. So one important thing to remember, after talking about these explicit forms of recognition of ICCAs, there are many other areas of international law that do support ICCAs without explicitly referring to ICCAs as such. So this includes many international instruments, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UN human rights treaties and treaty body decisions, There's UN General Assembly resolutions, a lot of case law from regional human rights courts and commissions, Sustainable Development Goals, FAO guidelines, and so on. Many, many more international instruments than just these. So when we're talking about international recognition and support for ICCAs, we should really consider this full range of international law and policy related to human rights and the environment. So not only the instruments that explicitly refer to ICCAs as such. And in the past few years, the ICCA Consortium has been increasingly working in these different international processes, talking about ICCAs, promoting appropriate recognition of ICCAs, and also learning from these other processes key issues that need to be addressed within the ICCA Consortium and within our sort of ICC discourse. So hopefully in the years to come, we will see more progress in recognition of ICCs within international law. And I'd like to acknowledge the hard work of many, many people in the consortium, our membership, as well as the Secretariat, who work tirelessly on international policy issues, and particularly making those links between the local level, so community voices and needs and priorities, bringing that up to the international level where it needs to be heard. That's a crucial link that we try to make in our work in international policy, from the community level up to the international and back to the community level. So appreciate the hard work of everyone working on this. It's definitely a consortium-wide effort. So for more information about ICCAs and international policy, please visit that section of our website on the left-hand side. So learning about ICCAs, under Read and Watch, and then under ICCAs and International Policy, and you'll see 6 different sections of the website there that you can explore more about ICCAs in those different areas of international law and policy. Thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me by email, as well as the regional coordinators who you can find on the website. Thank you.
I want to show you where in the website you can access this information and resources, as Holly said. Here is the homepage of our website. And very briefly, because I know that many of you already have heard about that, on the left side you have news on ICCAs as such, news and information, and a lot of resources. And on the right side you have the explanation and the details on what is the ICCA Consortium as such. If you go to the left menu, the green one, you have different sections such as Discover, which is a brief introduction on ICCAs. I would like to call your attention on this one, Read and Watch. On this one, we try to separate the information and the resources, because here is the place where you find all of the resources on the historical approach. And then we try to separate it, but sometimes one document is in several sections, but we tried to separate it from the local and national reviews and example of ICCAs, the regional scale, and the ICCAs in the international policy. In this one, you can have the overview that details all of these sections. And the overview, if I click on it, takes you to these different sections that we actually just mentioned today, but we didn't go in depth. But if you click on one, I just wanted to call your attention on that. You have a little introduction, and here some key international instrument mechanism and reports, and several pages there. The event and action in which we participated in, this one is on which we participated, and some other key resources on ICCAs in this context. There are also some other recommended resources that are related, not exactly to the action of the ICCA Consortium, but are directly linked with the ICCAs. So yes, that's all, and I think I already saw that there are some hands raised. So Theodore, it's...
Hello. Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello. you know, a lot of these mechanisms, legal things, all of that, make a preemptive assumption that the local governance systems have not been disrupted by any related set of processes ranging from brutal military regimes to deliberate government political infiltrations to whatever. So it's, you know, something that needs to be addressed in international policy, I think. So certainly in our areas, this has happened extensively based on our information. So it may be that there are legal things, let's call it, for lack of a better word, I'm not a lawyer, in the international legal system that can remediate that. Now, there's an awful lot of communities where these disruptions have taken place all over the world, not just in our area. And some of these have been quite rapid. Some of these have been quite slow to take hold. But in any case, I just thought I should make this comment and also ask if there is a way around it, you know, and somehow to remediate this process. For example, you know, there is the self-strengthening process, just to say that, for example, just to give you an example of this, but the self-strengthening process, for example, assumes that, you know, that the local governance system is still there, while people in some cases may even have been imprisoned, may even have been killed. So, and this may have happened over decades ago. So, you know, just to ask how that can be, if possible, you know, I know it's a little bit complicated, but a yes or no answer or a very general answer of potential would do about the remediative mechanisms in the international legal context with respect to this, and how that could govern the perhaps the collection of information for protecting these areas and the people who are still there. Thank you. I hope I was clear enough, but you can. Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ted. I think that's a really great and very complicated question, and probably would warrant a separate discussion, definitely. But I think your point about access to remedial measures, to remediation more generally for disruptions to ICCAs, if I understand you correctly. So there are many mechanisms, definitely, for basically trying to secure justice in the context of violations, whether it's environmental rights violations or human rights violations or both. And that's, you know, ranging from, on the human rights side of the UN system, there are different human rights treaties, and each of the treaties has a treaty body that can hear, well, most of them can hear complaints, more or less. There's also special rapporteurs on a range of different issues that can receive also forms of complaints, and they might do a sort of a mission visit to investigate it further. There are also a range of non-UN based mechanisms, including World Bank, other financial institutions, depending on the issue that you're concerned with. If it's, for example, a big development project or something with World Bank funding, or you know, another bank, HSBC or otherwise, most financial institutions have grievance mechanisms of some sort. So I'm not sure, I can't really address you specifically in detail at this point, but just to say,
but just to comment a little bit further, you see, there is always an issue of these things, but there is also issues with, it can blend in with more complicated issue with government corruptions. Sometimes what happens, like in many cases, the legislation, the national level legislation is, in our case, for example, in my country, national level legislation we know has been made, for example, for fish farms. It has been made from major stockholders in the fish farming industry, so which were members of parliament and still are. So, you know, for international legislation is very important in that respect, at least in many areas, I think. But for us, it is also important to be able to see if there are mechanisms for, you know, dealing with, of reporting corruption, reporting historical events that may be unknown to the international community like the UN, and reporting very importantly, because in certain cases, for example, that I know about from other parts of the world, and we suspect in our case as well, corruption by large international environmental organizations, which are all too happy sometimes to blend in with government or local level corruption in exchange for favors and power and whatever. So this, I think, is relevant to indeed everyone in the world. So that is why I am making these general questions. So I hope I was clear enough. You can answer generally, I guess. Can you hear me?
Yeah, thanks. And I think this, I'll try and keep it brief. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I think this calls to mind the necessity of having a very multi-pronged approach to advocacy and to engaging with legal systems. So in any one situation, community situation or otherwise, one kind of bundle of activities around an issue may not work, or probably won't work exactly the same in another local situation. So you need to have a really, multi-pronged approach to the advocacy. And if corruption is a really strong issue, there are, again, international mechanisms, national, regional mechanisms, especially in Europe, to pursue that kind of line of reasoning. In other countries, Malaysia, for example, wouldn't work very well. We just get shut down and thrown in jail. So it really depends on the local context, what a sort of a reasonable, viable legal strategy and advocacy strategy might be. And it really, it needs to be very tailor-made. So understanding what are all of the options is very important, and really taking a good, close, hard look at the sort of the political realities in your local context, vis-a-vis the legal options, and then maybe what might work in your situation. But sorry, that's really general, but I think it raises a good point in terms of each context is very different, potentially, and really needs a very tailor-made and multi-pronged, I would say, advocacy approach.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Theodore. Holly, can you see in the chat box the question from Sarah? Or should I read it? Or maybe you can read it and
sure. So Sarah's question is, I talked about the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples in international policy and law. Is there any recognition of the rights of local communities in the same? Very good question, Sarah. I did not plant that, but it is a good one. Yes, it is a very good question, and it's a very actively debated question as well by sort of policy wonks and international lawyers. So it's a sort of, again, a few aspects to that answer. I'll try and keep it brief, but in a nutshell, in the Convention on Biodiversity, they have discussed the notion of local communities in particular in relation to biodiversity and conservation. So there's sort of a list of characteristics, basically, that they enumerated in the process in the CBD. And so there is, at least in the CBD, framework for identifying, I guess, self-identifying is crucial still, local communities for that context. In terms of international law more broadly, there is a distinction, definitely, but there's a lot of case law, which is law coming from courts, around the rights of communities who are not necessarily Indigenous, but who really have a very strong connection to their territories or areas, and could be deemed to have rights similar in that sense to Indigenous peoples. Not the same, but similar, and the source of those rights are that connection, that really strong connection to the territory and area and the ways of life. So particularly in the inter-American courts, there have been some strong cases coming out around that. So the rights of Afro-descendant communities and others who are not Indigenous, but who have those strong connections. So there's more to say, but I think I'll stop there, just in terms of two aspects of local community rights in international law. There's definitely more to say, though.
Thank you very much, Holly.
So what, hello. So what I'm trying to say is that what may work in certain cases, what we are investigating in our case certainly, is how historical rights of simply the community itself being in an area can help that community push its case forward to legal success, to success at the legal level, that is. You understand what I'm trying to say? Just simple historical right. I've been here, you know, we've been here as a community for this amount of time in relation to another community or to this extractive industry or whatever. Historical rights to resource, historical rights to use of space, simple historical rights. Now, the thing with local communities is that sometimes local communities are very diverse, you know, because people have come from many other places. But in certain cases, it can be proven that local communities have been relatively, you know, pure over the centuries for whatever reason. I don't want it to sound very bad, but you know, there have been a lot of movements of population in certain local communities. So in that context, I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. How can historical rights, you know, simple presence or use of a resource, or how use of a resource is impacted by a community, irrespective of whether they can be classed as indigenous or not, couldn't that form a solid legal basis in certain cases at least? I think it can.
Yeah, it really depends on what legal avenue you're pursuing. So if it's within the national context, it would really depend probably on the national land law. And in some countries that do have indigenous populations or local communities, they might specify the time frame in which a community must have occupied or used their land, and that would qualify them for, here it's native customary rights, or, you know, similar iterations in other countries. If you're pursuing regional or international mechanisms, again, it really depends on the mechanism, and normally each one will kind of set the terms for whether or not they will accept a case or a complaint on the basis of things like historical presence and use. But certainly if you do have proof of that, it's definitely a positive thing for a case. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so just to tell you that, so when you are collecting information, that information needs to stand in a court of law. Okay, so it needs to stand well. So in that context, that information needs to have been collected, at least the way I understand it, in a specific manner, or in a set of specific manners, let's say a range of manners. So is that, you know, that's probably how it works, doesn't it? Just my question.
Yeah, so I think again, it really depends on which court and on which basis you're building your case. And again, each country or each subnational jurisdiction will have its own rules about evidence as well. So what is admissible in court and what's not. So I'd really encourage you to look at, you know, if you're pursuing a national court case, to really look at those evidence rules and to get some advice from a Greek lawyer about what would be needed and how evidence should be collected. Because it's normally cases involving community rights are tossed out on technicalities, and that's often around timeframes of case coming forward or things like evidence. So it's very good that you're thinking about these things. It's really crucial for cases.
And to know a little bit more about ICCAs and the ICCA Consortium, please visit our website or simply write to us. All the informations and links are in the description of the video here below. Thank you very much.